Hello, and welcome to another video on CIPD Level 5 Made Familiar, where we break down CIPD Level 5 concepts into clear, practical insights. In this video, we're focusing on 5CO02 AC1.5, where you have been asked to assess two different ethical perspectives, including how these could be used at Technivara to inform and influence decision-making. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to demonstrate an understanding of the requirements of the question, demonstrate an understanding of how to address the assessment criterion using the command verb assess, and develop well-structured responses that align with the assessment criteria and grading standards. With that said, let's dive into today's lesson. First, let's take a moment to unpack what this question is really asking you to do. In this assessment criterion, you are required to assess two different ethical perspectives and explain how they could influence decision-making at Technivara. In other words, you are being asked to examine two ethical perspectives, evaluate how useful they are in workplace decision-making, and make a reasoned judgment about their effectiveness within Technivara. Therefore, your answer must not only explain ethical perspectives, but also assess their benefits, limitations, and impact on organizational decision-making. Ethical perspectives become important because they influence how managers make decisions, treat employees, and respond to workplace challenges. But to what extent? Answering this question is particularly important in advising Technivara on the need for evidence-based practice and applying ethical decision-making. Show how ethical thinking can influence factors like how Technivara handles its grievances, whether automation should replace certain job roles, how managers deal with capability or performance concerns, and whether decisions prioritize profits, employee well-being, or fairness. Consequently, your response should demonstrate how ethical thinking can influence leadership styles, organizational culture, employee relationships, and the quality of decision-making at Technivara. Now that we understand the question, the next critical step is interpreting the command verb. Successfully answering CIPD assessment questions depends not only on subject knowledge, but on your ability to effectively address the command verb. Failure to do so often results in descriptive answers that lack the critical depth required for higher points. So, the command verb in this AC asks us to assess. To assess means to make a reasoned judgment about the quality, value, effectiveness, strengths, or limitations of something using relevant evidence and logical reasoning. Many learners confuse assessment with explanation or description. However, when the question asks you to assess, you are expected to go further than simply explaining concepts. In essence, assessment requires balance. You must consider both positive and negative aspects before reaching a justified conclusion. For example, instead of simply saying, utilitarianism focuses on achieving the greatest good for the greatest number of people, an assessed response would explore both the advantages and challenges of applying this ethical perspective within Technivara. Take a look at the following example. Notice how this response evaluates both strengths and limitations before reaching a balanced judgment? That is what assessment looks like. This response successfully assesses because it does not simply explain utilitarianism. Instead, it critically considers both the positive and negative implications of using this ethical perspective to influence decision-making at Technivara, while also evaluating the wider organizational impact those decisions may create. Now that we understand the question and the command verb, let us explore how to approach answering this assessment criterion effectively. To successfully meet the requirements of 5CO02 AC1.5, you need to recognize that this question has two key sections, and your answer must bring out both of them effectively. First, assess two different ethical perspectives, and second, explain how these could be used at Technivara to inform and influence decision-making. These can be addressed in four critical steps. 1. Identify and explain two ethical perspectives. 2. Weight the strengths and weaknesses of each perspective. 3. Apply ethical reasoning to Technivara's decision-making by assessing the impact of using different ethical perspectives on organizational decisions. 4. Reach a reasoned judgment or conclusion about their effectiveness. Let's break this down step by step. Step 1. Introduce and explain two ethical perspectives. Though not required, attempt to begin by briefly defining ethics in workplace decision-making. Keep this concise. The purpose is simply to demonstrate that you understand ethics relates to moral principles that guide behavior and decision-making within organizations. You should then introduce two ethical perspectives. Common examples include utilitarianism, deontology or Kantian, communitarianism, and altruism. For stronger depth and comparison, many learners commonly use utilitarianism and deontology because they approach decision-making differently. Start your writing with brief definition of each ethical perspective. For a clear structure, use subheadings to separate each ethical perspective. To maximize your word count effectively, keep definitions concise. Save most of your paragraph for weighing the pros, cons, and making your judgment, as demonstrated in the earlier example. Step 2. Weight the strengths and weaknesses of each perspective. After stating the definitions, proceed to consider the strengths and weaknesses. Do not be quick to state these pros and cons in writing. You could instead take them down as notes as shown. This acts as a starting point for developing critical thinking, helping you avoid moving on too quickly and encouraging deeper reflection before evaluating how these ethical perspectives apply to Technivara in Step 3. Step 3. Apply reasoning to Technivara's decision-making, assessing the influence and impact. Now taking the pros and cons of each ethical perspective into consideration, assess how they could influence management decisions, leadership styles, and organizational culture. Think critically. How would these ethical approaches affect leadership behavior? How does it impact different stakeholders? What are the organizational benefits and challenges? Consider this breakdown. Here, you can see that the learner places consideration on both the pros and cons of the ethical perspectives before making a judgment. Utilitarianism highlights benefits such as efficiency and organizational growth, but may negatively affect employees, while deontology promotes fairness and trust, but may limit flexibility. From this evaluation, the learner can easily develop a judgment and recognize that stronger decisions may arise in applying elements of both approaches. Step 4. Conclude with a reasoned judgment. Finally, your answer should end with a justified conclusion. Remember, an assessment requires judgment. Therefore, ensure to conclude by stating which ethical perspective may be more effective within Technivara in driving decisions that impact culture and growth, and explain why. Take this example. This conclusion stands out because it weighs both perspectives before reaching a balanced judgment, wrapping up a proper assessment. Step 5. Structuring your answer. Bringing everything together, a clear structure will make your answer easier to follow and examiner-friendly. To achieve this, use clear subtopics. Also, ensure to support your arguments with evidence and cite them accurately. Always maintain focus on Technivara's context and the need to move from traditional practices to evidence-based decision-making. Always remember, passing this assessment criterion is as easy as ABC. A. Apply the command verb assess. Always keep it in mind that an assessment requires balanced judgment. You must consider both strengths and limitations before reaching a supported conclusion. Avoid purely descriptive responses. Lean towards creating an understanding of how applying these ethical perspectives can be beneficial or limiting to Technivara, and where to strike a balance. B. Balance your word count. Set a clear word count to each AC before you begin writing, and ensure you stay within those limits when writing. Always remember to prioritize depth over breadth. This will help you manage the overall assignment word count effectively. See, cite, and reference. Always support your arguments with evidence from reputable external sources. Ensure you cite and reference at least 2 credible sources. Be mindful of your in-text citations and ensure to apply the year of publication. If you want to see a full example of a top-scoring answer, check out the link in the description below. If this video helped you understand AC 1.3 more clearly, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with other CIPD learners who may be struggling. Thanks for learning with me and see you in the next one.